Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Paulitics Show. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Dr. Marcus Scauso.
Hi, Paul. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself, what you do, things you do?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, my name is Marcus Scauso. I'm a professor of political sciences in the philosophy and political science department at Quinnipiac University. I do. So I teach, of course, which is one of my favorite activities in the world. But also my other parts of my work is service and research. I do quite a bit of research on some of the colonial legacies that still influence our lives today, even though sometimes we forget about them. And also thinking in relationship to sort of the alternatives, to move out of them, to move away and beyond some of these problems, if you will. And then in terms of this, same thing. I tried to work to think about diversity at the university and with the community.
So you mentioned post-colonial theory and things of that sort. I know you're an author who writes about specifically the approach decoloniality. Can you provide an elaboration, a little explanation of what that is?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd love to. So decoloniality is a theory that emerged from Latin America, or the way, at least the strand that I follow, emerged from Latin America. And some of the main concerns that it had, and still has, is that there are certain ways in which we view the world, internationally speaking, in relationship to countries, that continuously affect others, both internationally and domestically. So in Latin America, for example, the fact that we view Latin America as somewhat inferior or underdeveloped, or the backyard of America, has influenced politics throughout history. In the sense that the United States feels authorized often to tell Latin America how to behave, or what kind of government is appropriate and the such, which sometimes even led to dictatorships and supporting dictatorships. So some of these problems, in part because I am from Latin America and Argentina, but also just because we're concerned with the world, some of these issues of colonial legacies are the main sort of topic of research of decoloniality, and the areas at which the theory provides really interesting tools to help us think through these things.
So it almost sounds like it aims to evaluate the exploitation of Latin Americans and other oppressed peoples.
Yeah, and I think that one of the advantages of the theory is that, yes, so it focuses on different ways in which peoples are exploited or oppressed, right? And when we say different ways, I think that's one of the key advantages of decoloniality when it comes from the voices of feminist decolonial authors, right? I think that one of the advantages is that it allows us to view multiple problems at the same time. You know, some theories focus only on the issues of rights, or only on the issues of economic exploitation, or gender exploitation only, or something of the sort. Whereas this theory tends to focus on different kinds of oppression at the same time. Indigenous peoples, Afro communities, Latinos in the United States, certain women in Latin America, different kinds of problems at the same time.
So I know that what you're just describing is like an amalgamation of examining different issues and such, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't that potentially then argue that all issues are created equal and you're conflating all issues? So if a plight of one particular group may have more ramifications, shouldn't that be the main target?
So that's a really interesting question, right? Since the late 80s and the 90s, several feminist scholars have pointed out that feminist scholars and Black feminist movements in the United States have pointed out that when we focus on a single problem, consistently, we usually lead to a single solution, and we prioritize that above other solutions on other problems. And when we do that, we often tell other movements or other people or other struggles that they matter a little less, that they should either wait or get out of the way for true progress or true solutions to first happen, right? And throughout history, what these feminist scholars and activists have pointed out, and now also decolonial scholars are finding out in the history of Latin America, is that every time that we do that, we not only ignore other movements, we sometimes even violently erase them, violently move them out of the way. So throughout history, this focus on a single issue has become an excuse on behalf of solutions to continue oppressing other people. It's there's a very good phrase by this author who says, you know, we cannot destroy the master's house with the master's tools. And I think that's what, you know, these theories are referring to. If we're to move beyond some of the forms of oppressions that we have inherited, then we should do it thinking about multiple issues at the same time. Otherwise, we're going to continue telling others that they don't matter.
Okay. So just very quickly, then I have a follow-up question on that, because you mentioned you're mainly talking about international approach of this, but I also know that some of these theories can look inward into the history of a country, because you mentioned Black feminist groups and feminist groups in the United States as well. So to what extent does the oppression and exploitation of various groups of the United States, how can a decolonialist view that?
So that's a really interesting aspect that you're pointing out here, Paul. You know, if we only focus on the international and then only focus on the domestic as if they were completely separated spheres, then we forget the fact that there is a continuation of issues in both realms that affects people in the US and abroad. So when we talk about colonial legacies, for example, the very construction of the United States comes with a huge inheritance from people like John Locke, who wrote the Carolinas Constitution. And in this Constitution, he mentions that, you know, all human beings are equal. However, when he defines who a human being is, he determines that it is the pursuit of happiness and, you know, a few things that we regard as the identity of our society in the US today, right? And then others, such as indigenous people, didn't quite fit that identity, right? So he constructs the idea that there is a humanity that is related to reasoning and the pursuit of happiness and these things that are now the symbols of capitalism and a single form of modernity, right? And then all others were excluded. Now, the exclusion of others affects people in the United States, indigenous peoples, Afro-Americans, African-Americans, Latinos, affects others, and it affects the ways in which we in the United States view other people outside, abroad. So it's continuous kind of classification of people that affects both domestically and internationally.
Okay. So our next question has to do with why decoloniality. Is there a particular thing that you've read, an event that drew you to this? What made you choose this approach, like as opposed to something like Marxism? Is there a figure? Is there like an event that occurred to you in particular?
Absolutely. You know, this has something to do not only with theory. So it would be pretty easy for me to hide behind sort of objective scientific theoretical terms, right? But it also has to do with my own history, personally speaking. I'm somewhat in between a lot of categories, you could say, right? On one side, I am Latino, English is my second language. I became a citizen of the United States recently, and so there is that, right? But at the same time, a lot of people don't regard me as Latino because I'm more European descendant and such. And so this sort of being in between kind of thing, this hybridity, you could say, really led me to think about how we should perhaps focus not only on a perfect understanding of a problem and a perfect understanding of a solution, but also how the people in between are affected by these things. So I was concerned about issues of racism, but I realized that it's not just racism against, say, Black people or the indigenous people. It's also against all of the people that are sort of in the middle, you could say, of this ideology of hierarchy that get affected. And decoloniality, I think it's concerned with the people in the middle, in the sense that it is concerned with multiple problems, right? So it takes into account multiple experiences of problems and therefore multiple possibilities of solutions. That's what really drove me to this theory, to being able to essentially look for a better world, contribute to construct a better world while taking into account multiple experiences and multiple solutions.
Earlier in this interview, you mentioned the concept of developing nations, how the United States views them. I am under the impression that United States has adopted, and so has the UK, since the Thatcher and Reagan era, a neoliberal consensus in their approach to policy making, global affairs generally. Why is potentially the term developing nation not a phrase that we should use? And is there an alternative?
Absolutely. So, earlier I was talking about John Locke and the idea of the pursuit of happiness. You can connect that notion of the pursuit of happiness to neoliberalism, which is sort of an ideology that even emphasizes that aspect of humanity and takes it as the most important trait of our identity, right? It views human beings as selfishly oriented, consuming individuals, right? And from that perspective, it builds up what would be the best sort of governmental system, which is a system of laissez-faire and respecting the market and competitiveness and deregulating the job market and things such as those that we all know about. Now that's a single way of viewing the world, right? That's a single identity. And it regards that form of identity as the epitome or apex of modernity, as if, a capitalist society that respects laissez-faire is the top notch of modernity. And everybody else has to kind of strive to go there, to follow that model. Now that assumption leads to make everybody else seem as if they were sort of downwards organized in a way that they're less developed, they're less selfishly oriented capitalist societies, if you will. And so the idea is that you are developed and therefore you already have those characteristics. You've already learned, and you can tell everyone else that is developing, slowly heading towards what you've already learned what to do. And so that's the problem. It hides the assumption of superiority. It hides the fact that the United States and the UK have been able to develop by also exploiting other countries, also taking resources cheaply from other countries, or maybe getting other countries indebted and then paying interest and several other issues too. It hides all of that when we talk about developing.
Okay, so is there like a potential alternative to that phrase? Maybe I don't know. Is there?
So there's a huge debate about this, of course, because academics, we love to overly debate everything. But there's a really interesting article about using the phrase global south. Global south denotes hierarchy too, but it also has been used by for example, the non-aligned movement and several other movements from the global south to kind of create a political identity that seeks the possibility of a much more egalitarian international system and a more democratic international system. So I think that, to me, that's the phrase that I would use to describe this thing: global south, global north, thinking that the global south also has its capacity to create a different world and has a voice that it's equally valid as well.
Okay. So as we both currently know, there's these compulsory lockdown orders in the United States, but it's not exclusive to the United States. This virus has impacted the entire world. If you look at a map of where this virus has spread, it's practically every country, if not every country. How has the ramifications of COVID impacted the global South in relation to the global North?
Well, interestingly enough, it seems like a lot of countries from the global south, not all of them, but it does seem like a lot of countries from the global south are dealing with it in a way almost more successfully than parts of the global north. The amounts of deaths and the amounts of people sick, for example, in the United States is disproportionately higher than several other countries that were heavily affected at the beginning of COVID-19. So it's been really interesting, maybe because the global south has more experience with adverse circumstances. Maybe because they've been able to share information more quickly. There are debates as to why, but several countries of the global south have had less people sick and less deaths per capita than the United States currently.
Okay. So it's interesting that you bring up this idea of sharing information, though, because as me and you have spoken about prior, this may be a situation where the world reverts into like an isolationist status, where countries go back into their shells and decide not to play with these other countries because we're fearful. Because there's also this theory, whether or not it's true or not, but that China artificially created the virus. Now, I happen not to subscribe to that theory, but our president, for instance, is touting that. So that is what are your thoughts on that as a globalization perspective?
Interestingly enough, I have friends all throughout the world, and some of my friends in other countries are saying that this was actually created by the United States. Conspiracy theories right now are running absolutely wild, and even Mike Pompeo had to deny the fact that the discussion of China being the creator of COVID-19. I think this came out 3 or 4 days ago. He was interviewed, and he said that there was no data or evidence that China was the creator of COVID-19, even though the president continues to say that it's a possibility. I think that at this point we can just kind of dismiss it beyond any kind of, I don't know, campaign strategy or something of the sort, right? But I think you're pointing to something very important. There are, I think that there are several tendencies in relationship to the answer to COVID-19. One of them is a classic sort of sovereignty protecting, selfish, country-related approach of isolation, protectionism, closing borders, decreasing any kind of solidarity with international institutions such as the World Health Organization and things of the sort, or increasing competition too, for example, for for the vaccine. A lot of countries are competing right now because of the amounts of revenues and prestige that it would bring, right? But there are other countries also promoting a much more liberal stance in relationship to this, and actually increasing funding of international organizations and increasing the sharing of information, research, and the such as well. So there are like, this I think will be the two dominant tendencies. And then there is an array of other tendencies coming from indigenous peoples, feminist movements, or the other movements throughout the world that are talking about solidarity and are talking about rethinking our relationship with the environment, which is a conversation that hasn't really come up strongly by the most powerful countries in the world. This is an issue that needs a vaccine. Fair enough. We all want the vaccine, right? But that's not the solution to this problem. And the vaccine should not allow us to go back to normal, because normal is what brought us here. And so some of these approaches are talking about the need of respecting ecosystems more, so we don't get so close to unleashing these viruses that were contained within ecosystems when we were a little bit farther away from these environments and the such. So I think that there are ways in which we should rethink what is happening right now. And decoloniality focuses on the analysis of the problems of current governments and the benefits of some of this third wave alternatives, I guess you could call them.
So obviously in the United States, we have, I believe we're the #1 per capita of cases in the world. We have the most number of cases in the world, generally speaking. How would you respond to, because I know people of color in this country, people, the LGBTQ community, and generally the oppressed in this country are being hit hardest by this virus. Would you be able to lay into potentially why that is?
I think that, as a scholar of decoloniality, I can't help it but to connect it with colonial legacies, the ones that we were talking about earlier. The policies of our government historically benefit those who are regarded as more, quotes, rational, those who are sort of privileged as the representatives of true America, if you will. And so policies, for example, throughout the Trump administration, benefited corporations, which, by the way, are regarded as human beings in the United States, and CEOs and the such. Those are the identities that were privileged because they are regarded as the key agents of development and modernity and the pursuit of happiness and profit and capitalism. So they're the ones who benefited the most by the $2 trillion stimulus package. And then you see that policies create less benefits for those who are considered essential workers, but are not protected, don't have insurance, got a little bit of money through the stimulus, but everybody knows that $1,200 or the $2,900 is not enough to sustain a family paying rent. The 30 million that have lost jobs are not being protected well enough with a serious unemployment package. Immigrants are completely excluded from stimulus and the money that goes down to families. So you still see this exclusion of others that are not regarded as true Americans from the benefits that are created by policies. And this is historic. You can see a continuous line all the way from colonial times until now as to who benefits. And then you see that women and indigenous peoples, and Black people and Latino people are historically excluded from these things. And crisis only exacerbates the issue, shows the really old cracks in a way.
So there's just one more topic in relation to this, and it has to do with how the approach came about. It's a post-positivist approach, and it came out after the collapse of the USSR, when the positivist approaches, realism, liberalism, Marxism, didn't predict the fall of the SSR the way it did. After this virus, as we were talking about earlier with, the globalized community, is it a potential that those approaches, realism, liberalism, Marxism, and their subsets, once again gain legitimacy? And yeah, do you think that they can once again become legitimate and these post-positivist approaches lose that?
So that's a possibility, right? So liberalism, realism, especially liberalism and realism, never fully lost their legitimacy, right? I mean, they lost enough power in academia and in policy and in the government and everywhere else, in the sense that that they had to allow for alternative voices to come in and to say, by the way, you've been speaking about hard scientific facts all along, ignoring all of these voices, and here you are not being able to do that which you said you would do, right? So they lost some legitimacy, as you pointed out, right? But they never fully lost their kind of dominant space in academia and in policy. So, advisors or State Department people or academic, big academic scholars still use these approaches, right? And in the midst of this crisis, it does seem like people, redeployed the approaches that they're most familiar with. And so journals and international institutions and governments and the such go to the big names and the big journals and the such. And so you see a lot of liberal and realist scholars trying to weigh in the middle of all of this. And it is a possibility that we will continue to ignore other alternatives. But indigenous scholars, feminist scholars, decolonial scholars are all pointing out that, this normal is what brought us here. So maybe it is time to analyze the continuous issues that we've had and whether there is a way to create a better way of life, a better way of knowing, and a better way of being.
So I understand that you're also writing a current article. Mm-hmm. Is that potentially going to be tackled? The status quo can't be. So let's continue. Let's not rely on what brought us here.
So the article that it's more developed about COVID-19 and decoloniality, that article has been co-authored with 6 other authors from all over the world, which has been really challenging and fascinating. And that article what we are trying to do is use decolonial tools to show some of the legacies and problems that continue today. Some of the things that I've already mentioned, this continuous racist, privileging of some at the expense of others, how policies continue to create exclusion of certain others. So the article will focus a lot on kind of unveiling and criticizing some of these continuous issues and the ways in which they have been exacerbated now in COVID-19. And then at the end of the article, we show how certain decolonial thoughts and indigenous peoples are thinking about possibilities of cooperating that move beyond some of the mainstream notions, if you will. So we'll tackle it somewhat, but we decided to focus primarily on thinking in relationship to some of the problems that we're living today.
It's crazy times, and above all else, I've been telling everyone it's interesting, just to sit back and almost examine it, because we're locked inside. So to an extent, that's all we can do. But I want to thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I think I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me on the Zoom call. And thank you.
You're very welcome, Paul. This is my pleasure at any time. Please just call me back.
Will do. Thank you.